Welcome to Sleepytime History. True stories from the pages of history for a full night's rest. If this is your first time listening, let us know where you're tuning in from, or make a request for a future episode. And if you like what you hear, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us immensely. All right, it's time to settle in, relax, and take a wander through the pages of history and storytelling. Tonight, we're going to be exploring the remarkable Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, a man whose loyalty, discipline, and unshakable sense of duty led him to live in the jungles of the Philippines for 3 decades after the end of the Second World War. Still believing the war had not yet ended. Let your breathing slow and imagine yourself in a warm, tropical breeze where the rustling of palm leaves blends with the distant hum of waves, a place far removed from the hurried pace of the world. We begin our tale not in the jungle, but in a quiet moment of resolve when a young man received his orders and never let them go. The sky over Japan was the soft grey of winter when Hiroo Onoda stepped onto the platform of the Nakano School in Tokyo, a quiet place that bore little resemblance to a battlefield, but where war was very much alive in the minds of the men within. It was 1944, and the world had been at war for years. Japan was fighting for its life. Its empire stretched thin across islands and oceans, and the mood at home had become increasingly grim. Onoda was 22 years old, tall, thoughtful, and sharp-eyed. He had grown up in a world of old values and strict honor, where the emperor's word was law, and surrender was something not spoken aloud. He'd already served briefly in China, but now he had been chosen for something far more peculiar and far more secret. He was being trained in unconventional warfare, not for the front lines, but for the shadows. At Nakano, he studied sabotage, survival, deception, and how to live off the land. These were not the lessons of a soldier meant to win quick battles. These were the teachings of one who might have to wait months, years, even decades, before completing his mission. And then, one icy morning in December 1944, his orders came. He was to travel to Lubang Island, a remote and humid speck in the western Philippines. His mission: to disrupt enemy activity, destroy infrastructure, and resist occupation by any means necessary. He was to do all this without being captured, without taking unnecessary risks, and most importantly, under no circumstances was he to surrender. His commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, spoke with a quiet finality. If Japan fell, Onoda was not to give himself up. He was to melt into the jungle and carry on. The mission was more important than the man. So, with a satchel of rice, a rifle on his shoulder, and orders sealed in his mind, Onoda boarded a military transport. He gazed out the small window at the coastline, disappearing beneath him. He did not yet know that it would be nearly 30 years before he would set foot in Japan again. When he arrived in the Philippines, the war was already pressing in from all sides. The Americans were returning. Bombs fell regularly in the distance. The atmosphere was tense, a fragile thread holding back collapse. But Onoda had a task, and he believed in it. He found a few scattered soldiers, survivors like himself. They were unsure, some demoralized, some ready to give up. But Onoda reminded them of the orders: hold out, keep fighting, never surrender. So they took to the hills, deep into the forests, where thick vines and wild trees curled around narrow paths. The island became a living maze. The sun filtered through the canopy in green and gold patches, and the sounds of birds, wind, and distant surf filled the silence. They built shelters of bamboo and banana leaves. They moved at night, concealed their fires, stored what little food they could gather. Every now and then, they saw a plane fly overhead, or heard shouting in the village below. But Onoda was cautious, too cautious perhaps. He believed every sign of peace was a trick, and in his world of silence and strategy, there was no room for trust. As 1944 turned to 1945, and the Great War began to slip away from the wider world, Hiroo Onoda was only just beginning his. To him, the war would never end until someone came to tell him it had, in person, with the authority of command. And so quietly, without ceremony, he vanished into the forest with his men. A shadow in the jungle, a soldier waiting patiently in a world that was already beginning to forget. The hills of Lubang Island were wild and thick with life. Tall grasses swayed like waves, and dense foliage curled around the trunks of trees, creating a labyrinth of green. It was into this quiet, breathing wilderness that Hiroo Onoda disappeared, not in fear or haste, but with careful intent. He was not alone in the beginning. 3 others would come to form his tiny unit of holdouts: Corporal Shimada, Private First Class Akatsu, and Private Kazuka. All were young, but experienced, and each had, in their own way, accepted the strange and solemn mission that Onoda now carried like a flame through shadow. Their role was not to win battles, but to endure. At first, they moved cautiously from place to place, studying the terrain and mapping water sources. They found a secluded ravine and turned it into a kind of base. There, the air was cooler, the soil soft beneath bare feet, and the canopy above dappled the sunlight into shifting patterns. They built a crude hut, reinforced with bamboo and palm leaves, and dug small storage pits into the earth. Each day brought small routines: washing, mending, patrols. Each night brought silence broken only by insects and far-off echoes. They took turns keeping watch, rifles always close, packs always ready to move. And even though the jungle seemed timeless, the world beyond it was changing rapidly. Soon, the Americans landed. Explosions cracked through the sky. Onoda and his men watched from the tree line as foreign troops moved into the villages. Buildings were searched, radios confiscated, and leaflets began to fall from the sky. White slips of paper fluttering like snow, printed in Japanese. They bore messages of surrender, of peace, of a war concluded. But Onoda was suspicious. He examined one closely, noting its clean edges, its confident type. It didn't feel right. How could Japan surrender so easily? Why would the enemy tell them the truth? He recalled his orders. Never believe the enemy. Never lay down your arms unless told directly by a superior. And so he tucked the leaflet away and said nothing. The group became even more secluded, slipping into tighter discipline. They gathered coconuts and bananas, foraged for wild yams and edible leaves, sometimes killed a stray cow. They avoided contact with the locals, believing that every farmer might be a spy. They did not know that Japan had surrendered months ago, that their families, if they still lived, were mourning them as lost, that the emperor had spoken over the radio to a nation in ruins, asking all to lay down arms. To Onoda, the war still lived in the rustle of the trees and the distant sounds of machinery. He believed they were waiting for a signal, that somehow the Japanese army would return, that the war would resume, and they would be called from the shadows to complete their task. As months turned to years, their camp grew more resilient. They dried meat in the sun, turned discarded American equipment into tools, and built storage caches high in trees to keep things safe from rain and rats. Though time softened the contours of the conflict, Onoda's resolve remained firm. He shaved with care, kept his uniform as tidy as possible, and held daily briefings. His men began to refer to him as the officer, the one with the plan, the one who believed. In that belief, he found stability, even as they began to lose track of the seasons, even as the world forgot them. In a corner of a faraway island, under a cathedral of trees, Hiroo Onoda was still fighting the war, not with bullets, but with endurance, not in glory, but in solitude. As time passed, the jungle became more than a hiding place. It became a world unto itself. The rustling of leaves and the pattern of the stars guided their days and nights. Insects chirped like clocks in the darkness. The rhythm of nature became their calendar, though the years began to blur like mist over the hills. The war, as far as Onoda and his men knew, was dragging on. But strange things began to happen. More leaflets appeared, scattered from the sky or found folded into crevices of tree bark, as if placed there deliberately. They were printed in Japanese, yes, but Onoda read them with narrowed eyes. One claimed the war had ended. Another included the names of soldiers, perhaps known, perhaps invented. A few even mentioned the emperor's surrender. Onoda studied each one with the mind of a trained intelligence officer. The paper was too fresh. The grammar was too neat. The story too clean. It had to be enemy propaganda. Then came the loudspeakers. On some nights, in the far-off distance, they could hear voices amplified across the fields. They were speaking Japanese, sometimes reading letters, sometimes calling names. But Onoda remained unmoved. "They're trying to deceive us," he said quietly, with a steadiness that didn't allow for doubt. "It's just what they do to draw us out." His men trusted him. They knew his training had been special. They believed he understood, thing they didn't. And more than that, they wanted to believe the mission still mattered, that they had not vanished into the jungle for nothing. But still, a silence grew among them, a soft, creeping uncertainty that settled like dew. Occasionally, they saw villagers moving about, harvesting rice, tending to animals, carrying children in their arms. The rhythm of island life had returned, slowly and cautiously, as though the war had ended after all. But to Onoda, it looked like a performance, perhaps staged, perhaps under duress, another illusion. One day, they found a bundle of newspapers left in the forest, Japanese papers, real ones, with photographs and dates. The stories spoke of a nation rebuilding, of cities like Tokyo and Osaka stirring back to life. But how could these be real? How could they be allowed to see such things unless it was a trap? Onoda burned them carefully, one by one. If there was truth in them, it had no place here. Then, in a curious moment that seemed almost like a dream, they found a letter written by one of their own families, perhaps brought by someone from Japan, or perhaps a trick. The words were tender, pleading for their return. But still, Onoda could not believe. Even love, he reasoned, could be used as bait. So they stayed hidden, deeper than ever, like roots beneath the forest floor. Occasionally shots would ring out, sometimes from the men defending themselves, sometimes from locals, perhaps startled or afraid. It made the soldiers more cautious, and slowly, with each season, they withdrew even further from the edge of the world. Food became harder to find. Cattle grew more scarce. The jungle, their protector, was beginning to turn indifferent. And yet, Onoda would not waver. He trimmed his moustache with a fragment of mirror. He polished his rifle. He maintained their routine, even if only one man was left to follow it. Because in his mind, the mission was still alive, fragile but untouched, floating like a lantern in the fog. And until someone came to extinguish it in person, with authority and command, Hiroo Onoda would not turn away. The signs from the outside world might have grown louder, but to him, they were only whispers through the trees. The months, once clearly marked by seasons and weather, began to blend. Rains came and went, dry seasons passed in silence, and the little band of soldiers moved deeper into the folds of the jungle, beyond footpaths, beyond farms, beyond even the reach of curiosity. The world, as Onoda had known it, had faded. Only the mission remained. The group had dwindled to 4, and then, slowly, to 3. In 1949, after 5 years of hiding, Private Akatsu made a decision. Quietly, cautiously, and without ceremony, he left the group and turned himself in to local authorities. His departure was more than a shift in numbers. It struck at something deeply rooted in Onoda. Not anger exactly, more a hollowing sorrow. To abandon the mission was, in Onoda's view, to abandon not just orders, but honor. Still, he held no malice. He understood the weight of such a life. The jungle tested the soul in strange, slow ways. Akatsu's surrender brought new dangers. The Philippine police now had a better sense of where the others might be. Patrols began to comb the island, sometimes firing into the forest to draw them out. Occasionally, shots were exchanged. At times, they left food in the open, rice, cans of meat, placed beneath letters pleading for surrender. Onoda refused to touch them. To him, they were poisoned, not in body perhaps, but in intent. A kindness meant to soften the edges of resolve. Still, their existence in the jungle became harsher. Game was scarcer. The island's once open spaces now growing thick with brush and decay. Clothes wore thin, boots cracked. Rain seeped through shelters, no matter how carefully they were patched. But Onoda continued his daily rituals, inspecting his rifle, stretching quietly at dawn, reciting old orders in the back of his mind, like a prayer. He and Kazuka, the last man to stay by his side, began to treat the island like a fortress. They watched the terrain with the care of cartographers. They noted footprints, new growth, changes in the way vines crept over logs, anything that might suggest someone had passed through. Over time, they grew quiet with each other. There was little need for speech. A glance, a nod, the rhythm of movement through the underbrush said all that needed saying. They cooked in silence, slept in silence, waited in silence. Yet beneath that stillness, there was a deep companionship, not warm perhaps, but constant. They had both built their lives around a single point of belief, that Japan still needed them. Sometimes they found objects from the modern world, watches, flashlights, clothing. Sometimes they raided nearby farms at night, taking only what they needed, leaving behind tokens of money or notes in Japanese, explaining that they were not thieves but soldiers of the Emperor, still on duty. Years passed like water through fingers. Onoda no longer knew what year it was. He suspected the others had stopped remembering too. Occasionally they would find a new leaflet, or hear a voice calling through a loudspeaker. But these no longer stirred them. The outside world was like a forgotten dream. Their world was green and damp and unchanging, and they moved through it like ghosts. And in this long, breathless hush, Hiroo Onoda carried on. No medals, no fanfare, no knowledge of whether anyone even remembered he existed. Only the certainty that he had been given a mission, and that he was still carrying it. Because to abandon it now, after so long, that, he believed, would be the true surrender. The jungle had a way of folding in on itself. Paths overgrown in days, memories swallowed by vines, time softened like old cloth. And now, Hiroo Onoda was alone. In 1972, Private Kozuka, his last companion, was killed in a skirmish with local authorities near a rice field. It had happened quickly, a flash of confusion, a few fatal shots, and then silence. For Onoda, the loss was profound. Though few words had passed between them in recent years, Kozuka's presence had been a tether, a shared watch in the night, a second pair of eyes scanning the hillside, the comfort of footsteps not entirely his own. Now, even that was gone. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Onoda moved alone through the forest. His world became quieter, stiller, and more inward. He buried supplies at hidden points across the island, shifted sleeping locations each night, and sharpened his instincts to a fine edge. No fire, no noise, no lingering. Even his own thoughts seemed to grow softer, more like weather than words. There were no longer routines so much as rhythms, an early start, careful movements, the rustle of bamboo, a slow sip of water. Sometimes he'd sit for hours in the trees, watching the landscape for signs of change. A boot print, a broken twig, a scent in the air. He trusted nothing but the land beneath his feet and the mission sealed in memory. He still believed the war might reignite. That some corner of the Pacific could flare up again, calling him to action. The Japanese army might return. Perhaps he would see their ships from the cliffs. Perhaps someone would arrive through the brush, bearing fresh orders. So he waited, not with restlessness, but with a deep, unshakable sense of duty. In his solitude, he began to speak aloud, less and less. His thoughts moved like fog, quiet, unhurried, and thick with reflection. He remembered his training, his old commanders, the laughter of his comrades before the war had turned into shadows. But these memories floated past, like leaves on water. The villagers, by now, spoke of him like a legend. Some feared him, others pitied him. A ghost soldier, a man who didn't know the war had ended. But to Onoda, they were simply civilians, and civilians did not end wars. He would only believe in peace when it was spoken by the voice of command. Not on a leaflet, not from a radio, not from a stranger. And so, the years slipped by. Each sunrise was another chance to carry out the mission. Each moonrise, another vigil kept. Rain soaked through his worn uniform, but he still maintained it with care. His rifle remained oiled, his equipment neatly stored. He did not allow himself to become wild or careless, because to him, the war might still be waiting, just out of sight. And as the wind stirred the trees high above his hidden camps. Hiroo Onoda, now in his 50s, moved through the jungle as quiet as the mist, a solitary soldier still holding the line. It was early in 1974 when something unusual stirred the stillness of the forest, a rustle in the undergrowth, but not the familiar footfalls of a villager or the clumsy sweep of a search patrol. This was lighter, almost playful, and it carried no sense of danger. Onoda remained hidden, high in the trees, his presence invisible. From the dense green above, he watched a young man walking through the jungle alone. Not in uniform, not armed. He wore sandals with woolen socks, of all things, and carried little more than a bag and a camera. The man was Japanese. His name was Norio Suzuki, and his arrival on Lubang was something of a miracle. He had come not as a soldier or official, but as a traveler with a most unusual quest. He had told friends before leaving Japan that he was going to look for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. There was sincerity in his words, even if they made others laugh. But unlike the search parties before him, Suzuki came without force or persuasion. He came with curiosity, kindness, and a deep respect for the man he sought. Their first encounter was tentative. Onoda had been watching him for days, gauging his movements. Then, one day, he stepped forward, cautious, rifle ready, but not threatening. Suzuki did not run. He bowed gently. He introduced himself, calmly, warmly, in their shared language. Onoda was wary. He had seen too many tricks before, but Suzuki's manner was different. He asked questions not to trap or convince, but to understand. They spoke for hours, sitting beneath the trees, as the afternoon sunlight softened into amber. Suzuki listened intently as Onoda explained his position, his orders, and why he had not surrendered. Suzuki didn't try to debate. He simply nodded, accepting that Onoda was a man bound by something deeply rooted, not easily untied. Still, Onoda was firm. Unless his commanding officer came in person and gave him a direct order to stand down, he would remain in the jungle. No leaflet or friendly word could undo what had been sealed with military oath. Suzuki accepted this too, and then, just as gently as he had arrived, he left, promising to return. In the weeks that followed, Onoda waited. He felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, but a quiet curiosity. Could this be the thread that would finally connect his lonely world to the one he had left behind? He maintained his routine as always, but something had shifted. The stranger in the trees had not spoken like the others. He had not asked for surrender. He had simply offered presence. And perhaps, after all these years, that was what Onoda had needed most. For now, he returned to his shelter beneath the trees. The rifle was still close. The camp still hidden. But something had changed. Somewhere across the sea, the wheels were beginning to turn. Someone was listening. And soon, the voice of command, long silent, would speak once more. The air on Lubang carried the scent of rain and wood smoke, when at last the voice Hiroo Onoda had been waiting for returned to him. It had been nearly 30 years since his orders were issued, orders that had bound him to this jungle, to this quiet, watchful life. And now, in March of 1974, Norio Suzuki returned, just as he had promised. But this time, he was not alone. With him came an older man, in a neatly pressed suit and a calm, familiar bearing, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Onoda's former commanding officer. He had been tracked down in retirement, a civilian now, no longer part of the military. But to Onoda, it didn't matter. This was the man who had given him the order to hold out. And now, this was the only man who could relieve him of it. In a shaded grove on the edge of the jungle, beneath trees that had stood silent witness to decades of solitude, the two men stood face to face. Taniguchi brought with him a letter. Typed on official stationery, it bore the seal of the Japanese government. It acknowledged the mission and declared it complete. The war, it said plainly, had ended in August 1945. The Emperor had surrendered, and Onoda's service, long, loyal, and almost unbelievable, was no longer required. The moment settled over them like mist. Onoda stood still, his rifle at his side, his uniform patched and faded, but still worn with care. Slowly, almost reverently, he read the letter. Not once, but twice. His hands were steady, his expression unreadable. But inside, something was loosening, like the unfurling of a tightly wound spring. He asked questions, specific ones. Where were his comrades? What had happened to Japan? How had the world changed? And Taniguchi answered with patience, never rushing the moment, allowing Onoda to take the time he needed. This was no ordinary reunion. It was the closing of a life chapter lived in isolation, in absolute faith to an oath made so long ago. When Onoda was satisfied, he nodded. The next morning, he emerged from the jungle, stepping onto the path, not as a fugitive or an outcast, but as a soldier concluding his mission. He wore his uniform with quiet pride. Slung across his shoulder was his Arisaka rifle, well maintained, still operational. He carried his sword, his ammunition, and a few personal keepsakes, all carefully preserved. Filipino soldiers and villagers gathered, unsure what to expect. Some watched in silence, others cried, a few saluted. There was no need for ceremony. The act itself, walking out of the jungle after 30 years, was enough. Onoda presented his sword to President Ferdinand Marcos, who, in a gesture of understanding and goodwill, granted him a full pardon. It was acknowledged that in his mind he had never ceased to be a soldier. He had not acted in malice. He had merely followed his orders to the very end. The world blinked in astonishment. News spread quickly. The soldier who didn't know the war had ended. The man who had survived in the wild while entire empires rose and fell. But for Onoda, the attention felt unreal. He had not done this to become a story. He had done it because he believed he must. And now, with the mission complete, he turned toward a new life, one he had never imagined, in a world he no longer fully understood. But he had done what he came to do, and at last he could rest. The Tokyo skyline shimmered as the plane descended, light spilling across the buildings like a sea of lanterns. It was March 1974, and Hiroo Onoda was returning to a homeland that had long since moved on without him. He stepped off the aircraft in full uniform, the same olive-green fatigues he had worn beneath the trees, carefully maintained through decades of wind and rain. His rifle, still functional, was cradled in his arms. He bowed solemnly to the waiting officials, unsure of how to interpret the bright lights and clicking cameras that greeted him. For Japan, he had become a symbol of perseverance, of devotion, of a past many wished to forget. Crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the man who had emerged from another time. Some viewed him with reverence, others with discomfort, unsure what to make of this figure from the pages of history made flesh. But for Onoda, the world outside the jungle was strange and jarring. The streets were paved in ways he didn't recognize. The clothes, the cars, even the faces of the people felt unfamiliar. He found himself quietly stunned by vending machines, by neon lights, by the humming silence of electric trains. It was all so fast, so clean, so new, and yet it lacked something he couldn't quite name. The jungle had been harsh, but it had been simple. It had required presence, discipline, and constant awareness. Here, the pace was overwhelming, the noise unending, and the meanings harder to grasp. He visited his family, he met officials, he gave press conferences, answered questions, tried to explain, though he often felt there were no words that could bridge the years between what he had lived and what the world had become. He was offered financial support, recognition, opportunities, but these gestures, however kind, did not ease the disquiet within him. He wandered through the city with a soft gaze, his mind still halfway in the trees of Lubang. At night, he sometimes woke abruptly, unsure of where he was. The hum of traffic was not the same as the wind in the canopy. The clean sheets not the same as cool earth beneath a woven mat. His dreams were still threaded with jungle sounds, the call of birds, the hiss of rain on leaves, the distant snapping of twigs under cautious feet. Japan, for all its kindness, no longer felt like home. And so, in the quiet months that followed his return, Onoda made a decision. He would not try to fold himself back into a life that had moved on. Instead, he would begin again, somewhere else. He looked toward Brazil, where many Japanese emigrants had built new lives after the war. There, he imagined, he might find stillness again, fields instead of cities, simplicity instead of spectacle. Before he left, he visited the graves of his comrades, the ones who had held out with him, and the ones who had fallen. He offered silent prayers, not of sorrow, but of respect. They had shared something no one else could fully understand. A long, quiet war in the deep green of another world. And with that, Hiroo Onoda stepped away from the spotlight and toward a quieter chapter, carrying not the burden of years lost, but the quiet dignity of a man who had lived entirely by the oath he had once been given. In Brazil, where the land stretched wide beneath open skies and the rhythms of life moved with the seasons, Hiroo Onoda found a measure of peace. He settled on a small cattle farm deep in the countryside, far from the crowds, the noise, and the strange pace of the modern world. There, he rose with the sun and worked the land with his hands, learning the quiet language of animals, of soil and weather, of days marked by physical labor rather than memory. The stillness reminded him of the jungle, but without its vigilance. For the first time in decades, he slept without a weapon by his side, and yet the past remained close. He began to write. Slowly at first, notes, recollections, fragments of thought. Then more steadily, until his full story took shape in a book. No Surrender, My 30-Year War, was not written as a defense or apology, but as a clear, measured account of what he had lived through and why. In its pages, Onoda offered no dramatics, no embellishments. He spoke plainly of duty and trust, of his belief in the command structure, and the depth of meaning he had found in following orders to the end. He did not regret the years spent in the jungle. To him, they had been lived with purpose. But he also acknowledged the weight of solitude, the sorrow of losing comrades one by one, the long hours of doubt, where faith and fear often walked together. And he reflected on the difficulty of returning to a world so completely changed, a Japan he no longer recognized, and a people who could no longer quite understand him. He was not bitter, only thoughtful. He spoke sometimes at schools and gatherings, where people asked questions in quiet awe. How had he survived so long? Why had he not surrendered? What had kept him going? His answers were gentle, patient. He would explain that a soldier's honor was not rooted in the outcome of war, but in the integrity of following through. That belief in one's duty could anchor a person even when all else fell away. Yet, he was no romantic. He admitted that blind loyalty could be dangerous, that his experience was not one to be repeated lightly, and that peace, in its quiet and ordinary form, was something to be treasured. He did not seek attention. In fact, he often preferred silence. Long walks in the countryside, hours tending to cattle, small conversations under the evening sky. But he remained a man of conviction, carrying within him a calm resilience that neither the jungle nor the modern world could shake. In time, he returned to Japan more frequently, sometimes for interviews, sometimes to support outdoor education for young people. He taught survival skills, but more than that, he taught patience, discipline, and the value of self-reliance. He never boasted, he never rushed. Instead, he moved through the world like a quiet echo, a reminder of something steadfast and rare, a life shaped not by comfort or convention, but by an extraordinary inner compass. And, in the still hours before dawn, when the breeze moved gently through the fields, Hiroo Onoda often sat by himself, listening, not for danger, not for orders, but for the simple sound of the wind and the knowledge that, at last, he could just be. Years passed quietly, as they often do when the storms of life have long since faded. Hiroo Onoda aged with grace, his movements slower, his voice softer, but his gaze, calm and clear, remained as steady as ever. The jungle no longer called to him with urgency, but he carried it within, like a song remembered in silence. In 1996, more than 2 decades after his return, Onoda made a journey back to Lubang Island, not as a soldier, but as a visitor. It was a strange return. The land had changed. Roads had been built, villages had grown, and children now played where he had once moved like a shadow through the trees. And yet, beneath the surface, he could still feel the shape of the place, the contours of the hills, the line of the coast, the scent of rain-damp soil. He came not to reclaim anything, but to offer peace. There, in a quiet ceremony, he gave thanks to the people of Lubang, the very people who had once feared him, who had lived alongside the myth of the hidden soldier. He apologized, humbly, for the hardships his long campaign may have caused them. It was a gesture deeply felt by all who heard it. And in that act, something long held was released. Not shame, not regret, but a soft and healing understanding. The war had ended long ago, but now at last, its echo was laid to rest. Back in Japan, Onoda continued to live simply. He married in his later years and remained active, in teaching. He founded a nature school, helping young people develop strength of character through outdoor experience, not through hardship for its own sake, but through learning patience, resilience, and harmony with the natural world. He encouraged them to face challenges with humility, to stay calm in adversity, to listen to the world, to themselves, to silence. He rarely spoke of his time in the jungle unless asked directly. And when he did, he chose his words carefully. Not every listener could understand the weight of 30 years lived by a code of loyalty. But he did not seek to convince, only to share gently if they wished to hear. As he grew older, he withdrew from public life, preferring the rhythms of quiet days. He passed away in 2014 at the age of 91, leaving behind not just a story, but a question about duty, belief, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. To some, he remained a relic, to others, a hero. But perhaps most of all, he was a reminder that even in a world of change, there are still those who live by the compass of something deeper. Not the noise of the moment, but the soft, steady call of conviction. And now, somewhere in the hush between the trees and the turning of the stars, the long watch is over. The soldier rests. We hope you enjoyed this story about the remarkable Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. His tale is not just one of endurance, but of a singular kind of faith, in duty, in command, and in the meaning of personal honor. It's a story so unusual, so quietly profound, that it feels almost like folklore. And yet, it is entirely true. Onoda lived in a time when Japan's values were drawn sharply from its military code: obedience, loyalty, perseverance unto death. Trained at the Nakano school, he was taught not simply to fight, but to endure. Not to win battles, but to hold fast in isolation, to be the ember that never extinguished. And in a way that few could have foreseen, he carried out that mission with absolute clarity for nearly 30 years, beyond the end of the war. What makes Onoda's life so extraordinary is not simply that he survived for decades in the jungle, though that feat alone is astonishing, but the mindset with which he did so. He believed in his mission not out of stubbornness or delusion, but out of deep, solemn responsibility. His orders were not just military instructions. They were a thread that connected him to a vanished world, a promise he wouldn't break. And yet, when the moment came, when his commanding officer finally appeared, bearing the words he had long waited for, Onoda laid down his weapon with dignity, not in regret, not in defeat, but in quiet fulfillment. There is much we might feel about such a life: admiration, sorrow, awe. But perhaps more than anything, we are reminded of the complexity of human belief, how our identities can be shaped not by what happens around us, but by the inner world we hold close. Onoda lived in history's shadow, but he did so with clarity and purpose that still resonates. From him, we learn that honor can be both a guide and a burden, that the world can change while we remain unchanged, and that sometimes peace is not a moment, but a long, quiet path we take when we are finally ready to lay down the past. Hiroo Onoda's story is not simply about a war. It's about a man who, in the midst of silence, found meaning, and who, when the time came, walked gently out of the jungle and into history. That's all for tonight's journey through history. Whether you're fast asleep or still drifting there, thank you for listening. Until next time. Rest well.